A flight attendant dumped hot oatmeal onto a black CEO's face. He had no idea the man he just disrespected would turn the entire flight upside down. He thought humiliating a man with a tray of hot food would prove control. He didn't realize the person he targeted never loses his composure. Subscribe if you believe dignity always wins over cruelty. The tray lurched forward in a stuttered arc of motion. A thin film of steam trailed after it, rising like a ghost from the bowl of oatmeal now tilting precariously in the grip of a flight attendant's trembling hand. It wasn't dramatic, no crashing sound, no shout, but it was enough to draw a flicker of attention from Seat 3A. Elias Corrin turned his head slightly, brows narrowing at the slosh of hot liquid that narrowly missed his briefcase by inches. A few globs had already landed on the edge of the fold-out table, threatening to drip onto the polished charcoal fabric of his tailored suit. "Apologies," murmured the flight attendant. His name tag read Darren. He stood stiff, his posture too upright for comfort, eyes flitting not to the spill but to the man before him. Elias looked up, expression soft. "It's all right," he said, voice even. "Accidents happen." He didn't reach for a napkin. Instead, he gave a faint smile, reassuring, composed, the kind that put most people at ease. But Darren Vale didn't seem put at ease. His jaw tightened, lips thinning into a line that might have passed for a smile to the untrained eye, but to Elias, who spent most of his life reading boardroom body language, it felt oddly off. Performative. A flicker of tension, quickly masked. "Of course, sir," Darren said, stepping back and briskly retrieving a cloth from his side pouch. As he dabbed at the table, his movements sharp but quiet, Elias noted the man's avoidance of eye contact, the speed of his breath. It wasn't nervousness in the usual sense, not fear, something heavier, resentment. Still, Elias said nothing more. He nodded, returned to his seat, and unfolded his tablet. The screen lit up with the header of his upcoming presentation. Project Paradox, Protocols for Next-Gen Biometric Defense. A mouthful, but important. This was the culmination of 7 years of work, failures, breakthroughs, refinements, and now, with one major deal signed just hours before takeoff, the real rollout began. All he needed was a few hours of quiet to finalize the framing. No distractions. No drama. He didn't notice Darren standing a few paces away, staring at the header now visible through the aisle reflection on the cabin wall. Darren turned stiffly and walked toward the galley. Inside, his breathing changed. The pleasant veneer dropped as he gripped the metal shelf's edge, pressing his palms flat against its cold surface. His knuckles whitened. "Paradox," he whispered almost inaudibly. The word was acidic in his mouth. He remembered it too well. That was the name on the project notice board the day he had walked into Arkvale's interview panel room 3 years ago. He had made it to the final round. He had the certifications, the clearances, the ambition. What he didn't have, apparently, was the psychological green light. Unfit for leadership roles due to aggressive emotional instability, the rejection letter had read. Elias Corrin's name had been on that letter. Not a signature, just a printed line of executive approval. Darren hadn't forgotten it. He'd memorized it. And now the man sat 20 feet away, dressed in success, sipping sparkling water while polishing the code that had once been his dream to write. Back in 3A, Elias made a note to refine Slide 7. He wanted to emphasize the rotating keyframe sequence, a mechanism that, if applied properly, could neutralize ID forgery in high-volume transit hubs. He barely noticed a figure hovering in the aisle again. Darren passed slowly, his expression unreadable, his smile practiced to the point of blankness. "Would you like coffee, sir?" he asked softly. Elias glanced up. "No, thank you." Darren lingered for half a second longer than necessary, then turned. From the seat behind Elias, a passenger stirred. Mid-30s, dark jacket, sharp eyes. His name was Nolan Greer. a business traveler who had silently watched the interaction. He wasn't eavesdropping, but he wasn't blind either. Something about the flight attendant's tone had bothered him, polite but sharp beneath the surface. Elias returned to work, unaware that his calm had become the seed of someone else's storm. Near the galley, Darren picked up another tray, slowly. With each item he placed, utensils, drink canister, napkins, his mind replayed that phrase from the rejection letter. Unfit for leadership roles due to aggressive emotional instability. He had deleted it from his inbox years ago, but his brain never had. He paused as his hand hovered over the oatmeal pot. The metal lid gleamed under the warm cabin lights. For a second, his fingers curled around the handle, not to serve, but to grip. A tremble passed through his arm, a suppressed quake. Then he let out a breath and forced his hand steady. Not yet, not clumsy, not obvious. He would wait, let the moment find him. He walked slowly back toward the first-class cabin, tray balanced in practiced hands, and paused at the threshold as a slight rumble passed through the plane. Turbulence. Minor. He smiled. Elias felt the bump and looked up briefly. Nothing alarming, just air pockets over the central coast. He went back to reviewing slide 9. The tray moved again, its shadow gliding across the floor like a silent warning. Darren's footsteps were deliberate now, rhythm matching his breath. He approached seat 3A, his voice polite as ever. "Breakfast, sir?" Elias nodded, glancing up. "Yes, thank you." He didn't see the twitch in Darren's left eye, didn't notice the half-second delay before the tray lowered, but something in his gut prickled, a flicker of unease, without logic or reason, and then the oatmeal pot tilted, just a fraction, just enough to tease gravity. Not yet, not now, but close. The thread had been tied, and neither man knew it, but destiny already did. Sometimes, Elias thought idly, unaware of what had begun, the calmest journeys hide storms that haven't yet been named. Steam curled from the spout of the coffee pot as Darren Vale stepped down the aisle, his steps smooth, his posture rehearsed. The early light spilling through the windows gave the cabin a warm, false comfort. A few passengers stirred, yawning or stretching into the day, but seat 3A remained focused. Elias Corrin didn't even notice the flight attendant's approach. His fingers glided across the tablet in front of him, tapping and swiping through layer upon layer of encryption protocols, his expression tight with thought. Across the aisle in seat 4C, Nolan Greer's gaze flicked from his window to the screen in Elias's lap. His eyes narrowed slightly, not out of rudeness, but recognition. He wasn't a tech expert, but he knew a blueprint when he saw one, and the header was too large to miss. Arc-Veil Prototype. Project Paradox. Nolan blinked. That name had surfaced in a few late-night reports online, whispered among digital security circles. He tilted his head ever so slightly, curiosity now sharpened into interest. Darren noticed everything. He had just finished topping off a cup of decaf for an older man in row 2 when his eyes locked on Nolan's shifting posture. Then he saw the tablet, saw the words. His pulse ticked upward. Project Paradox, he repeated silently, his jaw tightening so subtly it nearly went unnoticed. His gloved hand gripped the coffee pot with sudden tension. That name, it wasn't just a file to him. It was the opportunity he'd lost, the career he'd nearly touched before being deemed unfit. The phrase came back, clear as the day it was emailed. Psychological instability, unsuitable for leadership roles. His rejection from Arc-Veil had been polite in wording but brutal in implication. He had spent weeks afterward pacing the same cramped apartment, reciting the letter like scripture, wondering what he could have done differently, what he could have proven. And now, fate had seated him face to face with the man who bore the Arc-Veil crest like royalty. Darren could still remember Elias's name in the press, always dressed in sleek, dark suits, always celebrated for transforming algorithmic theory into real-world application. And now Elias sat, completely unaware, revising a protocol that could, according to rumors, eliminate synthetic ID fraud entirely. One swipe of that tablet could rewrite national border policies. And Darren, he was passing coffee. He took a slow breath and approached, the tray in his other hand rattling faintly as the aircraft shifted with minor turbulence. Not enough to disrupt anything, barely perceptible, but just enough to be used, if one knew how. "Coffee, sir?" Darren said evenly, addressing Nolan but angling himself toward Elias's row. His eyes briefly darted to the screen. Still there, still open. Nolan nodded, snapping out of his train of thought, and took the cup with a nod of thanks. Darren moved on, but not before memorizing the layout of the interface, the design of the header, and the location of a small drive port nestled against the edge of the tablet. His fingers twitched. What would it feel like to take something back? In the rear galley, he set down the tray and stared at the closed oatmeal container. The warmth radiated gently from it, undisturbed. He lifted the lid slowly, watching the steam rise. It wasn't the kind of heat that boiled wildly. It was quiet, patient, thick. He stirred the contents with a slow, deliberate motion. A memory flickered. The day he received the rejection. He'd held the printout in one hand and an application letter from Hallworth Systems in the other. He had torn both. The only thing that survived was the rage. He closed the lid and began plating trays, each movement intentional. He muttered quietly as he worked, his voice low, almost inaudible beneath the hum of the engines. "Some burns," he whispered. "Teach lessons no letter ever could." The oatmeal struck with a wet, horrifying slap. It splashed across Elias's face in a thick, steaming wave, boiling, clinging, scalding. There was no warning, no time to react. One moment he was reaching for his glass of water, the next his world exploded in searing white heat. His body jerked violently against the seatbelt, back arching, hands instinctively flying to his face, but it was too late. The viscous liquid clung to his skin, burrowing into every pore like fire with weight. A collective gasp sliced through the first-class cabin. For a beat, no one moved. The sound of the pot clattering against the service cart echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence. Then chaos bloomed. "Get help!" someone shouted from the rear of the cabin. Elias let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like a strangled growl of disbelief and agony. He clawed at his suit jacket, tearing it open with trembling fingers as oatmeal dripped in clumps from his collar. Steam rose from the fabric. The smell of burnt skin mingled with the sharp scent of spilled coffee and cabin disinfectant. Darren Vale stood over him, frozen in place, one hand still extended in mock horror. His lips moved slowly, forming words that didn't match his eyes. I'm so sorry, sir." Turbulence. It was. There was a shift. His voice was a carefully measured performance, just loud enough for the other passengers to hear, just breathless enough to sound sincere. But Elias saw something else. A flicker, a twitch at the corner of Darren's mouth that wasn't fear or regret. It was pleasure. A smirk, buried beneath layers of practiced concern. A man in a navy sweater 2 rows back, a doctor, judging by the urgency in his voice, rushed forward and knelt beside Elias. "Cold packs. Quickly, we need to cool the skin now." Another flight attendant scrambled to open the emergency first aid drawer as the doctor eased Elias's head forward, dabbing at his temple with a napkin soaked in ice water. "Don't rub," the doctor warned, voice steady but urgent. "We need to reduce the heat without breaking the blisters." Someone hold his arm down. He's in shock. Elias's vision pulsed with pain. Everything blurred, the lights above, the movement of bodies, the pressurized silence suddenly broken by rising voices. He could feel his own breath stuttering in and out, every inhale jagged, as if the air itself burned. But even as his nerves screamed, his mind began to separate from the pain. Years of conditioning, boardroom battles, political maneuvering, split-second decisions in billion-dollar deals had trained him to think through chaos. Through the agony, he forced himself to remember the moment just before the spill. Darren had leaned forward deliberately, his arm steady, no hint of imbalance, no jolt of turbulence. There had been no warning chime from the cockpit. No one else had been thrown off balance. This wasn't an accident. He felt it in his gut, deeper than the burn on his skin. The oatmeal hadn't tipped, it had been poured, measured, delivered. Elias opened one eye, vision foggy but locked onto the galley's polished metal surface. Darren had turned away from the scene, back to the service station, wiping his hands with a towel. The reflection in the panel caught his face, calm, untouched, eerily composed. And then Elias saw it. The smirk, faint, satisfied, gone in an instant. That was all the confirmation he needed. Clenching his jaw, he pressed his palm against the icy compress now resting on his cheek, willing his breathing to slow. The doctor kept speaking to him in a low, calm voice, reassuring, clinical, but Elias barely heard him. His attention had shifted entirely. He replayed the seconds in his mind like a surveillance tape. Darren's angle, the false stumble, the premeditated placement of the tray. His internal security instincts kicked in. Motive, method, opportunity. Elias's company handled biometric encryption, data worth millions, sometimes lives. The timing, the proximity, the target. It wasn't coincidence. It was calculated. "Sir, can you hear me?" the doctor asked, pressing gently on Elias's shoulder. Elias nodded faintly. His lips were blistered, his voice cracked when he spoke. "I need—" "The purser," he rasped. The doctor furrowed his brow. "We're landing soon. You need to focus on keeping still." "I need this logged, officially," Elias interrupted, forcing strength into his tone. Darren returned then, bearing a fresh towel and speaking again in that careful, public voice. "Truly, sorry, sir. I can assist with a cleanup if needed." "I've notified the captain." Elias didn't respond directly. He kept his eyes fixed on Darren's face, watching for tells. He knew better than to lash out. Revenge, if that's what this would become, was most effective when cold. Darren reached toward him with the cloth, but the doctor blocked him instinctively. "He's got it under control," the doctor said, tone clipped. Behind them, a few passengers were filming now, quietly, subtly, but visibly. One of them, a younger man across the aisle, locked eyes with Elias. He nodded once, slowly. Recognition. Witness. Elias breathed through the sting, the ache, the flood of adrenaline. And then, as the doctor adjusted the compress on his chest, Elias reached toward his meal tray. His fingers, trembling, stiff, found the fork. The metal was warm, bent slightly at the edge from earlier. Slowly, deliberately, Elias curled the handle inward, warping it into a crude, bent arc. It was nothing, useless for eating, but it was something else now. Proof, a marker of what had happened, of how he had responded, with clarity, not chaos, with focus, not fury. He turned the bent fork over in his hand, then placed it beside him like a relic. Then he looked up at Darren. Through dry lips, voice cracked but steady, he whispered, "Some things return full circle." Darren's brow creased slightly. Maybe he didn't hear. Maybe he did. But Elias didn't need confirmation. The seed had been planted. Some hands tremble not from guilt, but from satisfaction disguised as duty. The boiling oatmeal had barely finished sizzling against Elias's skin when chaos erupted. Voices clashed across the cabin as passengers leapt from their seats, some shouting for help, others craning their necks to see. One man reached for the overhead button, stabbing it repeatedly while another called out, "Is there a doctor on board?" But Elias Corrin remained still in seat 3A, his face contorted in agony, lips parted in a strained gasp, his hands gripping the armrests as if anchoring himself to the moment. Steam rose from his suit, and the acrid smell of burned flesh mixed with synthetic fibers filled the air. His right eye was clenched shut, his left, wide open and unblinking, locked onto a single target, Darren Vale. The flight attendant stood frozen near the service galley, a damp cloth dangling uselessly from one hand. His mouth moved with delayed urgency. I'm so sorry. There was turbulence. I lost my footing. But there had been no turbulence, no jolt, no warning. Just a smooth glide, followed by a deliberate flick of the wrist that launched the scalding breakfast onto Elias's face. It wasn't the burn that made Elias tremble, it was the calculation behind it. Another attendant, a younger man named Brent Halley, rushed over with a first aid kit. "Sir, stay still." "We need to cool the burn immediately." He tore open a cold pack and gently pressed it to the side of Elias's face. Elias hissed sharply, more from shock than pain, but he nodded, forcing composure. "I need the purser," Elias said through cracked, drying lips. His voice was hoarse but deliberate. Brent looked startled by the request. "Of course, sir." Right away, moments later, the purser, an older man named Calden Mertz, arrived, clipboard in hand. He took one look at Elias and visibly stiffened. "We're alerting the captain. Medical crew will be waiting on the ground. I'll log the incident immediately." But Darren interrupted before he could finish. "It was an accident. The cart shifted. I wasn't ready for the turbulence." "There was no turbulence," Elias cut in, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. The purser hesitated. His eyes flicked between them, uncertain whether to mediate or observe. "I want the full report logged," Elias said, still gripping the cold pack against his cheek. "Under incident protocol." Including crew names, Darren's jaw flexed. "That's unnecessary, sir. We can resolve this without dragging the crew into disciplinary." Elias turned his gaze to him, and for the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of his unburned lip. It wasn't friendly. "Some things," he said slowly, "should be dragged." Behind them, unnoticed by most, Nolan Greer sat quietly in seat 3C, his phone angled discreetly toward the scene. His hands didn't shake. His expression was calm but focused. He'd seen Darren lean too close, watched how stable his footing had been before the spill. There had been no stumble, no accident, and now no remorse. Nolan had no stake in the situation, yet something in Darren's composure unsettled him. He kept recording. Meanwhile, Elias's mind had begun to pivot. The burn seared like a live wire across his skin, yet it was already being absorbed by something deeper: strategy. Every instinct from years of navigating boardrooms and betrayals flared to life. He wasn't just in pain, he was in motion. He kept watching Darren. The flight attendant had stepped back now, hovering near the cart, pretending to be busy adjusting trays. But Elias saw through the act, the calculated distance, the perfectly timed deflection. Darren wasn't nervous. He was managing the situation, managing the story. The purser returned from a brief check-in with the cockpit. "Captain's notified. We'll have medics at Norbridge upon landing. Can I offer—" "I'll walk off the plane myself," Elias said, voice steadying. "Just log it all. And make sure Mr. Vale here doesn't touch another tray until this is resolved." Calden nodded, lips thin, and stepped away. Darren offered no apology. Just a blank look, like a man observing the outcome of a completed task. Elias shifted in his seat. His hand hovered over the meal tray beside him, eyes settling on a single object, a metal fork. Its prongs glinted under the cabin lights. Slowly, deliberately, he picked it up. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from pain and resolve mixing into one tight cord of focus. He bent the handle inward with both hands, just slightly. A meaningless act to the unknowing eye. But it was ritual. A mark. Proof that even now, in agony, his mind remained precise. Brent returned, placing another cold pack in Elias's lap. "We're almost there, sir." 15 minutes to descent. Elias nodded once. Then, looking past Brent toward the galley, he locked eyes with Darren. The man didn't flinch. Neither did Elias. He held up the bent fork just enough for Darren to see it. And then, in a voice dry and rasped but unbroken, Elias said, "Some things return full circle." The flight attendant's face didn't move, but in his eyes, for a flicker of a moment, something shifted. Recognition. None knew what Elias meant yet. Pain burns quick, but purpose burns slow. The wheels hadn't even touched the ground yet when the cabin pressure shifted, not from altitude, but from something far heavier. The silence after the chaos hung thick as a blanket over the first-class cabin. The mechanical ding of the captain's voice announcing descent barely registered in the minds of those seated near row 3A. Instead, their eyes remained fixed on the man hunched in his seat, his face blistered, blotched red and raw beneath a compress soaked with meltwater and gauze. Elias Corrin did not wince. He did not groan. He sat perfectly still, his posture upright as though dignity alone could hold his broken skin together. But beneath the cloth pressed to his cheek, his jaw tightened. Pain lanced across his temple, curling into the bones behind his ear. Still, he didn't let it sway him. He had spent years learning how to control chaos under pressure. He would not unravel now, especially not in front of him. Just ahead of the cabin, flight attendant Darren Vale adjusted his tie, rehearsing lines under his breath. He gripped a clipboard with whitened knuckles, flipping pages not for review, but for performance. His words were soft, measured. Turbulence struck early, tray slipped, reacted as fast as possible. Then a pause, a glance at the other attendants who were quietly cleaning what remained of the breakfast carts. One of them, a younger man named Bryce, glanced toward Elias's seat and opened his mouth, but then thought better of it. Darren gave a single shake of the head. Authority, not guilt, held command. In row 3B, Nolan Greer sat quietly with his phone tilted at an angle against the tray table. He had not said much since the incident, but his hands had moved fast. Too fast for Darren to notice in the heat of chaos. And now, that moment, the pouring, the scream, the smirk, sat inside the phone's memory, cool and absolute. As the plane began its final descent, seatbelts clicked. Elias remained silent. His fingers, trembling beneath the compress, curled around the bent metal fork he had reshaped earlier. It was still warm from his palm, its edge dulled from the pressure he had applied to twist it sideways. The absurdity of holding such an object after such violence did not escape him. But for Elias, it wasn't absurd. It was symbolic. Control, even now, in the smallest object. The wheels hit the tarmac with a jolt. Oxygen masks above did not fall, but every passenger's breath came as though they had. A collective silence followed, broken only by the whine of engines slowing. Flight attendants moved about, performing safety checks, but all eyes drifted to Elias and the crimson blot soaking through his compress. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice returned, calm and distant, "we've arrived in Norbridge. Medical assistance is waiting at the gate. Please remain seated." The door hadn't even opened before two paramedics boarded. One knelt beside Elias, gently removing the compress to examine the wound. The man's face hardened. "Second-degree burns," he muttered to his partner. "We'll need to transport." "I'm not leaving on a stretcher," Elias interrupted. His voice was ragged but firm. The medic hesitated. "Sir, I highly recommend—" "I walk out," Elias repeated, "on my own terms." The medic looked into his eyes and saw something stronger than pain. Resolve. He nodded. "Then let us brace you." Slowly, with each movement deliberate, Elias rose from his seat. Gasps whispered from passengers still buckled in. His suit jacket hung awkwardly, one sleeve soaked and scorched. His cheek was blistered, red down to the collarbone. But he walked, head held high, every step echoing on the cabin floor like a statement. At the front, Darren stood stiffly. "Sir, he began. Elias stopped. One unburned eye met Darren's gaze, cold and surgical. "Don't," Elias said quietly. The word cut deeper than any accusation. As Elias reached the door, cameras from the terminal flashed through the glass. Word had spread fast. Flight 347 was not anonymous anymore. Passengers craned their necks trying to glimpse the CEO who had suffered mid-air assault and refused drama in return. But behind the curtain, something else occurred. As Darren turned to return to the galley, a hand brushed his. He looked down. Nolan Greer, casual, quiet, passed him a small object no larger than a car key. A voice followed, hushed and heavy with intent. "For proof," Nolan whispered. Darren's lips parted, but nothing came out. He turned to look at Elias, too late. Elias was already descending the jet bridge, blood still trickling from the corner of his jaw, the bent fork gleaming faintly in his grip. He didn't speak. He didn't look back. But under his breath, the words landed soft as ash and twice as scalding. "You feed what you cook." The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and betrayal. Elias Corrin lay still, upright in a mechanical bed that hummed gently beneath him. The left side of his face was wrapped in gauze and surgical mesh, a slow drip feeding cool saline into the blistered tissue. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, indifferent to the weight pressing down on the room. Outside the window, night had fallen without fanfare. Inside, time felt suspended, thick, slow, surgical. Dr. Kalen Voss stood near the foot of the bed, clipboard in hand, his tone professional but softened by an undercurrent of concern. "Second-degree burns, mostly superficial. You're fortunate the eyes weren't hit." With care and therapy, minimal scarring Elias didn't blink. His one unbandaged eye stared forward, not at the doctor but past him, through him, toward some unseen point far beyond the walls of this recovery room. He nodded once, mechanically. "Understood." Dr. Voss hesitated, as if unsure whether to say more. Then, without another word, he stepped away, leaving Elias alone with the machines and the ache, not just in his face, but in something deeper. It wasn't the pain that haunted him. It was the silence. The airline's statement had gone live an hour earlier. A mild turbulence, an unfortunate accident. Crew acting quickly, passenger stable. The hashtag was already spreading. Hashtag Oatmeal flight. Memes. Speculation. Corporate damage control. Somewhere out there someone was laughing, but not Elias. He reached slowly toward the nightstand where a simple black flash drive rested beneath a sealed envelope of discharge instructions. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked it up, not from weakness, but restraint. With methodical slowness, he inserted it into the hospital's patient use terminal, ignoring the pain as he leaned forward. The screen flickered to life. Grainy footage appeared. The cabin, the tray, the pot, the moment. Elias's breath slowed. He didn't flinch when the oatmeal hit his face again on the screen. He didn't turn away at the moment his hands clawed for his own eyes. Instead, he watched Darren Vale, the man in uniform, the man whose voice feigned apology as he stood too still, reacted too late, and most damningly, smiled just enough. Pause. Rewind. Play again. He zoomed in, slowed the frame, replayed the wrist movement, the trajectory of the pot, the slight glance toward Elias before the pour. No turbulence, no jolt, just intent, masked by performance, a flicker of a smirk. "Calculated?" Elias muttered, his voice raw and low, like a man testing fire on purpose. He leaned back against the raised hospital bed, exhaling slowly through his nose. His hand drifted toward the object resting beside the terminal, the bent metal fork from the flight, wrapped in a napkin, untouched since the moment he had twisted it midair in a quiet act of defiance. Now he held it again, rolling it between his fingers like a totem. Not rage, not a weapon, a reminder. Everything about the event had been curated to look like chaos. But chaos didn't smirk. The burns were real, but the performance was rehearsed. His board had already called, urging caution. "We advise you not to escalate," one executive had said, voice tense over speakerphone. "Let legal handle this quietly." Focus on optics, Elias remembered his answer clearly. Silence. Not because he agreed, but because words, at that moment, were too small. Now, staring at the paused footage of Darren's face on the screen, Elias saw not just betrayal, but opportunity. The kind of opportunity few recognized in the middle of pain. The kind that required a patient man to bide his time while others panicked. Elias had built an empire on identifying patterns. And this was no isolated cruelty. This was a message, a test, a move in a larger game. The camera panned slightly as the video continued. Nolan Greer's angle caught not just the act, but the aftermath. Darren fumbling too late, suppressing a grin, watching Elias writhe. The motive may not yet be clear, but the malice was unmistakable. He would find out why. He would uncover the layers, who gave the signal, who arranged the crew manifest, who knew he'd be in seat 3A that day. And when the time came, they would all answer. But not yet. Now was the time for stillness. Elias turned the fork once more in his hand, pressing the bent side gently into his palm. It hurt. He wanted it to. Then he whispered to no one, except the room, the silence, the memory that would never fade. "The quiet man's revenge," Elias whispered, "is the one that echoes the longest." Elias Corrin stepped into the boardroom without a word, the quiet click of the glass door behind him sounding louder than it should have. A soft scarf, deep navy in color, was wrapped neatly around the lower half of his face, hiding most of the raw, healing burns. His movements were deliberate, his gaze steady, neither hurried nor hesitant. Yet the atmosphere shifted the moment he entered. Executives fell silent. The usual chorus of chairs scraping, whispered jokes, and tablet taps faded into a breathless hush. No one expected him to return so soon, certainly not like this. He placed a small black flash drive on the center table, its plastic shell catching the light from the overhead fixtures. The room was chilled by overactive air conditioning, but it might as well have been the air of judgment settling over them. Without explanation or preamble, Elias walked to the display terminal and inserted the drive into the system. A soft chime rang out. Then the screen lit up. The footage played in absolute silence. No music, no voiceover, no warning. It began with Darren Vale walking down the aisle, tray in hand. The camera, shaky but focused, captured every detail. The angle of the wrist, the unnatural pivot, the splash, the scream. Gasps broke across the room like distant thunder. Several executives leaned back in their chairs instinctively. Elias stood to the side, arms crossed, letting the evidence speak before he did. When the clip ended, he pressed a button. The screen went dark. No one spoke. He turned to face them. "That," he said, voice calm, muffled slightly by the scarf, "was no accident." A beat passed, then another. "But we're not suing," Elias added, his voice sharper this time. Several brows lifted in confusion. Heads turned. One board member, Jerome Van, leaned forward. "You're not, what?" Jerome asked. "You were attacked, Elias." "On video. This could sink Hallworth and the airline." "I'm not interested in sinking anyone," Elias replied. "I'm interested in making them reveal who else is swimming." He let the silence linger just long enough before continuing. "This wasn't personal. Not just. It was strategic. It was meant to delay us, interrupt our timetable, scatter our momentum. If I retaliate too soon, I only give them a defense. But if they scramble first, if they panic, cover, and slip, then we don't just win. We expose." The boardroom remained stunned. He turned to Mason Derrick, his trusted operations head, who had sat quietly through the entire meeting. I want you to open an internal ethics probe. Quiet, no alerts. Dig through every interaction, every comm, every side contract. I want everything cross-referenced with Hallworth systems, especially flight scheduling. Find out who put Darren Vale on that plane." Mason gave a silent nod. He understood without needing further instruction. Elias moved toward the long table and placed both hands on the cool surface. The bandage under his scarf itched, but he didn't flinch. "We won the defense deal because we earned it. But someone out there, someone with reach, wanted that changed, so they used pain to force delay. My face was just the messenger." The phrase struck the room like an echo chamber. "But we can send a message too," he added, standing straight again. "One they don't expect, one they can't dismiss as coincidence." Later that evening, Elias stood alone in his private office on the top floor of Arkvale Tower. The city blinked below him, a constellation of steel and ambition. The window reflected his figure back to him, half covered, half revealed. The light from the desk lamp caught the faint lines of healing skin just beneath his scarf. The pain was manageable. What mattered more was what it signified. He opened a secure line and reviewed the first set of logs Mason had sent, scheduling assignments, personnel routes, anomaly flags. One file in particular stood out. Darren Vale had been assigned to that flight just 72 hours before departure. An override code had been used to bump another attendant from the roster. That override came from a third-party contractor, Hallworth Systems. His jaw tightened. He closed the file and opened a clean document. A blank slate. A new phase. The time for reaction was over. As he shut down the screen, Elias turned to the full-length mirror beside the window. He unwrapped the scarf slowly, revealing the healing side of his face, red, stretched, tender. The other side remained untouched, but both halves belonged to the same man. A man no longer surprised by betrayal, only driven by it. He stared at his reflection, voice low, measured, certain. "Now it's my turn to write the next line." Elias parked 2 blocks away from the quiet row house, leaving the engine running just long enough to hear the tick of the cooling hood before he shut it off. The neighborhood was still, lit only by the yellow haze of street lamps and the soft glow of televisions flickering behind drawn curtains. He adjusted the dark collar of his coat and walked calmly, deliberately, until he reached the corner property with its slanted porch light and untrimmed hedges. Darren Vale's residence. He didn't knock. He didn't intend to. This visit wasn't for confrontation. It was for observation. Elias crossed the street slowly, blending with the shadows. From the safety of a tree-lined edge, he watched the front window, partially veiled by uneven blinds. A faint argument rose from inside, muffled by the walls but unmistakably heated. A silhouette gestured wildly, Darren's short frame, hands slicing the air in frustration. Another man stood beside him, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. Even through the distortion of tinted glass, Elias could make out the emblem stitched to the fabric. Hallworth Systems. His jaw clenched. The confirmation stirred something deep. Not rage, not yet, but a cold clarity. Darren wasn't acting alone. He had ties, and Elias had just caught him in a moment he couldn't fabricate later. Silently, he raised his phone and began recording, keeping the frame steady despite the tremble beginning in his fingers, not from fear, but from the weight of what this meant. Inside, Darren pointed toward a folder on the table and shouted something too muffled to hear, but the gestures told enough. The tall man responded with an aggressive step forward. Then a third figure emerged, a slimmer man in a dark vest holding a phone in one hand, his expression tight and wary. 3 men, 2 strangers, 1 linked to sabotage. Elias tapped the record button again and slipped the phone into his coat. He didn't need to witness more tonight. He had what he came for: confirmation, coordination, conspiracy. It was all falling into place, and now he would shape the path forward, carefully, methodically, as he always had. Back at his apartment, the silence was thick, the kind that lingered between battles, not because peace had been won, but because the next move was being sharpened. Elias poured a glass of water but didn't drink. His eyes were locked on the bent metal fork sitting on his desk, a utensil that had become a monument. He picked it up, felt its uneven curve in his fingers, and sat at the desk with the lights dimmed low. His laptop screen glowed softly beside him, open to an encrypted email draft meant for Nolan Greer. Before sending anything, Elias replayed the footage he'd recorded earlier that week. Nolan's video. The clarity of it still stunned him. No turbulence, no chaos, just a steady hand, a calculated pour, and Darren's faint, unmistakable smirk. It hadn't gone public yet. Elias had kept it sealed, knowing too well that evidence was strongest when used at the right time, not just when emotions surged. He'd reached out to Nolan 2 days prior. They had met quietly, in a parking garage beneath an office complex where neither man would be recognized. Elias had worn a scarf over the fading burns. Nolan had kept his camera bag slung over his shoulder, as if clinging to a lifeline. His eyes had darted nervously, but his voice was steady. "You really want to do this?" Nolan had asked. "If I release that footage, I'm in the middle of a legal minefield." Elias had answered with calm conviction. Truth isn't defamation, it's documentation. Now, sitting in the dim stillness, Elias drafted the next step. But it wouldn't be the video, not yet. That would ignite too early. Instead, he would start with the audio, an internal flight log he had received from a contact within the airline's IT systems. A quiet whistleblower, one of the few decent men left among the mess. The file wasn't dramatic, no screams, no shouts, but it held a single, devastating sentence. Darren's voice, clear and logged, special passenger in 3A, carrying data of high interest. That alone shattered the airline's official story. If it was just a breakfast accident, why was Darren reporting Elias's identity in advance? He attached the audio file to the encrypted email and sent it to Nolan with a single line of instruction. Leak this, not the footage. Not yet, timing was everything. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Elias could already sense the shift beginning. The media wouldn't understand the full picture yet, but they would latch on to that phrase. Data of high interest. It would spark speculation. It would raise questions. And it would make the airline panic. That was the point. Back at his desk, Elias placed the fork in his palm again. The burn on his cheek had started to fade, but the memory had not. He twisted the fork slowly, bending it one last time, sideways, imperfectly, deliberately. The metal groaned faintly, resisting before yielding to his will. He looked at the bent shape and set it upright on the desk like a sculpture. Flawed, purposeful, singular. "When something breaks," he murmured to himself, the words dry but sure, "it can still serve, just differently." The metal gleamed faintly under lamplight like a promise made tangible. He poured oatmeal across the CEO's suit, laughing as the cabin gasped. If you believe mockery under a uniform deserves accountability, hit subscribe now. Justice doesn't shout, it steadies its hand. The moment the memo leaked, the press turned feral. It was a single PDF, posted anonymously to a mid-tier aviation watchdog blog, but within hours, it spread like dry grass catching flame. The memo came from inside Hallworth Systems, marked Confidential Internal Operations Strategy, and bore a cold, bureaucratic heading, Operational Disruption Tactics, Competitor Neutralization Methods. Among its many sterile lines, one stood out in bold, Disrupting Competitor Operations via Tactical Interference. No names, no dates. But to those who had followed the incident now dubbed the Oatmeal flight, the implication was unmistakable. By noon, camera crews crowded outside Ryanair headquarters in Westbridge, lights glaring against the steel and glass facade as reporters pelted staff with questions. Is Darren Vale still employed? Was Arkvale Systems targeted deliberately? What ties exist between Ryanair and Haworth Systems? No official stepped forward to speak. Executives inside the building scrambled, their internal Slack threads a mess of panic, legal consultations, and urgent media damage control. But Darren Vale was gone. The airline's spokesperson released a sterile one-line update. Mr. Vale has been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the video evidence that had already begun circulating online through cryptic snippets shared by a few brave passengers. Meanwhile, Elias Corrin sat in his private residence, a penthouse suite overlooking Norbridge's Riverbend skyline. The room was quiet, lit only by the blue glow of several screens. On one monitor, the memo scrolled slowly. On another, muted live news coverage of the unfolding media storm. His face remained calm, expressionless, even, but his hands, folded over the bent metal fork resting on his lap, gripped a little tighter. The airline had made its move earlier that morning. Their official statement called the incident a tragic misunderstanding caused by unexpected turbulence and human error. They offered sympathy, not responsibility. That was their gamble. Downplay the damage, hope time eroded memory, and move on. Elias decided it was time. He called a press briefing. It was not held in a courtroom or a corporate conference room, but in the private screening chamber of the Arkvale Systems main campus. Seats were limited. Only verified journalists were allowed in. No telecast, no recording equipment. Just eyes, ears, and one single truth waiting to be played. At exactly 4 p.m., the room dimmed. The only source of light came from the central screen. Elias walked in alone. No entourage, no legal team. His scar, half-faded but still unmistakable, was uncovered. He offered no introduction, no greeting, just a nod toward the technician. The video began. It showed the cabin from a side angle, captured by Nolan Greer's discreet wrist cam, a modified device typically used by investigative journalists for discreet, stabilized footage. The room went silent as the events unfolded, frame by frame. Darren Vale's movements were clean, intentional. No stumble, no turbulence, no chaos. The pot tilted with mechanical grace. The oatmeal spilled, not accidentally, but exactly. The audio captured the faintest smirk in Darren's tone, the shallow delay in his response, the casual indifference as Elias screamed and passengers panicked. And when the clip ended, there was no need for commentary. Gasps filled the space. One journalist dropped his pen. Another whispered, "My God," under his breath. Elias stepped forward, his voice low, precise, almost too quiet for the microphone. "This is what a planned burn looks like." A hand shot up. "Why didn't you release this earlier?" a reporter asked, eyes wide. Elias looked directly at him, his expression unwavering. "Because I wanted every liar to speak first." The silence that followed was thunderous. Outside, the internet detonated. Within hours, #wanted every liar to speak first trended globally. Darren Vale's name surged to the top of search engines, eclipsing even political headlines. His past, his credentials, his abrupt employment at Ryanair, all were dissected in public view. Bloggers, journalists, and amateur sleuths pored over airline crew records and Haworth bidding history. No one found coincidences, only connections. Haworth Systems stock dropped 11% overnight. Their CEO, Marston Creve, refused interviews. Shareholders demanded answers. And at Arkvale, Elias stood by silently as the storm he had orchestrated from the shadows finally crested into daylight. But he knew the fire had only begun to burn. Behind the closed doors of his office, Elias reviewed the next file. He had traced a payment from an offshore account routed through 3 shell corporations. The final destination linked back to someone far closer than Darren Vale. But he would not act yet. The groundwork had to be perfect. Timing was everything. He leaned back in his chair, the bent fork still in his hand, now cold, its once sharp edge dulled by months of waiting. Yet in its imperfection, it gleamed with resolve. His mind sharpened not with rage, but with the cold satisfaction of precision. The reporters thought today had been the climax, but Elias knew better. This, he whispered, placing the fork gently beside his laptop, was only the smoke. The fire was still coming, and in that final moment of the press briefing, as the journalists departed in stunned silence, Elias's words lingered in their ears, printed later in every newspaper, headlining every blog. "The fire he started," Elias said quietly, "will show whose hands were really holding the match." At 2 a.m., the conference room at Arkvale Systems was a study in shadows and silence. The city outside was drenched in rain, streaking the tall glass windows with long, jagged lines that shimmered under the dim emergency lights. The only glow inside came from the slim LED strip beneath the tabletop, casting a cold halo on the document spread between two men. Elias Corrin sat at the head of the table, his shoulders square, the scarf once shielding his healing face now folded neatly beside him. His eyes, still sharp despite exhaustion, locked on the black dossier lying open like a wound. Opposite him sat Mason Derrick, Arkvale's head of operations, loyal, precise, and chosen for moments like this. Neither spoke at first. The silence wasn't awkward, it was loaded. On the table rested printed payment ledgers, encrypted message logs, and a decoded line typed in stark courier font. Target neutralized. Temporary incapacitation achieved. Elias stared at those words, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle in his cheek jumped. His fingers hovered just above the page as if touching the phrase might burn him again. "The time stamp," he said finally, voice low and measured, "is the exact minute Flight Ryan 347 began its descent." Mason nodded, his own expression unreadable. He tapped a thin document to the side. That line came from a communication channel routed through Hallworth's private contractor server. But the payment, that's the twist. Elias shifted forward, gripping the edge of the table. "Go on." Mason slid a secondary sheet across. The routing number, account tag, and signature code were clear and horrifying. "The funds used to pay Darren Vale didn't come directly from Hallworth," Mason said. "They were funneled through a dummy account registered to Arkvale's subcontractor division." For a moment, everything inside Elias went still. Not a thought, not a breath. The betrayal didn't hit like a thunderclap. It arrived like a needle, sharp, precise, and deep. He slowly leaned back into his chair, eyes drifting toward the rain-slicked windows. "So, it wasn't just sabotage," he muttered. "It was betrayal, from inside." The room fell quiet again. The sound of rain tapping the glass was steady, almost metronomic, like a countdown. Mason broke the silence. "We've narrowed it down. Only 4 people in the subcontractor oversight division had clearance to sign that routing path." Elias didn't turn his head. "And one of them is the mole." Mason hesitated. "We believe so." Elias closed his eyes briefly. He could feel the bent fork in his coat pocket, cool, smooth, a misshapen memory that reminded him of control, of focus, of war without fire. "Who are the 4? Mason listed them. 3 names passed without a flicker. "The 4th, Lauren Keel," Mason said. Elias opened his eyes. That name stirred something. Old hesitations, remembered inconsistencies. Lauren had been with the company for nearly a decade. Clean record, impressive results, too impressive, and he had been the one who pushed hardest for approving Hallworth Systems in their early bids. Elias's jaw tightened again. "He vouched for Hallworth before we even knew they were in the defense race," he murmured. "I remember." Mason leaned in, lowering his voice. We think he used a series of misdirected invoices to bury the transfer under standard contract expenses. He didn't just authorize it. He built a smoke screen. Elias finally stood. The movement was quiet, deliberate. He walked to the window, looking down at the sleeping city, streets empty, lights flickering in the puddles below. The world was quiet, but inside him, purpose stirred like a wind rising beneath a calm surface. He knew exactly when I was flying. Knew what I was carrying. Yes, Mason said, and that flight was designed to delay you. The burns weren't meant to cripple, just slow you down. Elias didn't move. He succeeded, Mason added, for a time. Turning slowly, Elias walked back to the table, picking up the black dossier. His eyes scanned the final page, an email thread between two shadowed aliases. The last message read, "Confirm asset disabled. Proceed with contingency." He looked to Mason. "How secure is this intel?" "Triple verified," Mason replied. "Came from a Hallworth source who didn't want to be part of something this deep." Elias nodded once. Then he spoke, calm as if ordering coffee. "Lauren doesn't know we suspect him. Keep it that way. Set up a mock audit next week. Let him walk into it himself." Mason blinked. "And what about now?" "Now?" Elias said, placing the dossier back into its folder and sliding it into his briefcase. "We don't push." Not yet. Mason stood as well, tension pulling at his features. "Elias, if he realizes—" "He won't," Elias cut in, but his voice remained calm. "Because he thinks the storm already passed." Outside, the rain picked up, sheets now. A streak of lightning cracked far away, its reflection flashing in the high-rise glass. Elias's hand brushed the bent fork in his pocket once more. It wasn't rage that filled him. It was precision. It was time. He moved toward the door, stopping just before exiting. Without turning, he spoke once more, quietly, like a truth carried on the wind. "It wasn't about the spill," he said. "It was about slowing the machine." Then he stepped into the hall. The rain behind him blurred the world like a fading photograph, but his steps were steady, controlled, unshaken. "And revelation," he whispered, "always arrives last, but never late." The projector screen flickered to life in the dimmed conference room, casting a pale glow across the tension-wrapped faces of those inside. A single line of digital text appeared. "Confidential. Internal wire logs." Lauren Keel stood frozen just a few feet from the screen, his confident smirk from earlier now fading under the weight of what he was seeing. The wire transfers were detailed and methodical, amounts, dates, and transaction routes listed with merciless precision. One after another, payments that had once slipped quietly through international dummy accounts were now laid bare in high-resolution clarity. And at the bottom of each transfer, his signature. It hadn't started like this. Earlier that morning, Elias Corrin had stepped through the revolving glass doors of Arkvale Systems. The sky beyond the horizon hadn't yet lightened, and the lobby lights were still half-dimmed for night operations. His reflection passed over the glossy marble floor, showing faint lines of scarring across his cheek, fading but undeniable. He didn't flinch at the sight. There was no time for emotion. By 6 a.m., he had met with Mason Derrick in the operations suite. Mason, wide-eyed and clutching the dossier that contained the damning logs they'd obtained from Hallworth Systems, wasted no words. "It's Lauren," he said. "He left a trail." Too clean, Elias had nodded, unsurprised. "How soon can we set the room?" "Today. We frame it as an internal audit. He'll come. He trusts his position too much." Elias didn't reply. He simply stood, adjusted the collar of his coat, and walked to his office with a single objective ringing in his mind. Truth isn't found. It's forced to reveal itself. By midday, Lauren had arrived at the building, briefcase in hand, tailored suit sharp, and his eyes brimming with self-assurance. Elias greeted him in the corridor outside the boardroom with a cordial nod. "Thanks for agreeing to a quick review," Elias said, voice smooth. "Of course," Lauren replied. "Standard protocol, right?" Elias's eyes didn't blink. "Exactly." The air inside the boardroom was cool and still, the kind of manufactured calm that makes every breath feel measured. Mason stood near the console, fingers ready to cue the slides. Elias took his place near the head of the table, saying nothing yet. Lauren stepped in with a soft chuckle. "So, what's this about? Compliance stuff? Or another security shakeup?" Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward the projection screen. "Let's begin." The room darkened. The first wire log appeared, and then the second. By the third, Lauren's smile had faltered. His hand, which had earlier adjusted his cufflink with ease, now twitched faintly against his thigh. He glanced at Elias. "What am I looking at?" Elias's voice was low but firm. "Patterns. Motives. Mistakes." Lauren's throat moved visibly as he swallowed. The final transfer loaded, time-stamped to the day of Elias's flight. The memo line read, "Target incapacitation, 72 hours." Lauren backed a step. That could be anything. These aren't proof. Anyone could have used my signature?" Elias interrupted. "Or your clearance, your access to project briefings, or the direct message you sent to Hallworth's finance department 3 days before the incident." Silence hit like a dropped weight. Mason tapped a button. Another screen flicked up, an email log. It was Lauren's, and it was damning. Lauren's eyes darted to the exit for a brief second. "This is a setup," he said quickly, voice rising. "This is all circumstantial." But his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. Elias stepped forward, his tone colder now. "Strange thing," he said softly, echoing their earlier conversation, "how my attacker knew exactly what I was carrying." The room held its breath. Lauren gave a half laugh, but it cracked in the middle. "Coincidences happen," he muttered. Elias studied him, watching for the flickers beneath the surface, the slight twitch in the temple, the shifting weight from foot to foot, the way his hand trembled near the table edge. Guilt wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet and desperate. Mason moved behind Lauren, closing the conference door gently. The final image appeared, a freeze frame of Darren Vale receiving a phone call minutes before takeoff, traced back to a number registered under Lauren's internal contact list. Lauren exhaled sharply. His shoulders sagged. "You don't understand," he said finally, voice cracking. "Do you know what they offered me? What I've built for this company? I was overlooked for years. You handed everything to Golden Boy Projects and forgot the people who kept your floors running." "You sold our future," Elias replied, voice controlled but heavy. "You handed our integrity to people who use fire as leverage." Lauren leaned against the wall, defeated. "They said it would just be a delay. That no one would get hurt. But someone did," Elias said. "You made sure of it." Mason stepped forward, revealing the small camera mounted discreetly above the screen. "Everything's recorded. Your voice. Your admission." Lauren's face turned pale. Elias took one final step toward him, his gaze firm and unblinking. "When you spill pain," he said, voice slow and deliberate, "you should expect to drink it too." Lauren closed his eyes. The fire he had started was no longer just a means to slow a rival. It was now a flame that would consume him whole. Some fires burn only once. The rest, they spread. The courtroom was silent but thrumming with unspoken tension. Cameras panned slowly across the rows of spectators, journalists scribbled with furious intensity, and the judge's gavel sat untouched, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Darren Vale stood at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, his skin pale under the fluorescent lights. He looked smaller now, no longer the man who had carried out a calculated attack in the uniform of service, but a figure stripped of authority, exposed. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Darren didn't respond. His hands twitched slightly, as if still haunted by the memory of the oatmeal pot and the heat of the cabin light when it all began. Elias Corrin sat in the front row of the gallery, his face fully uncovered for the first time in public since the assault. A thin, red scar curved from his temple to the edge of his cheekbone, a quiet but undeniable mark. He wore no bandage, no scarf, only a steel-gray suit, pressed to perfection. Yet it was his stillness that commanded attention. He sat upright, composed, not as a victim begging for justice, but as a man demanding truth. The footage played on the large screen without sound, but the images screamed. The deliberate tilt of Darren's wrist, the angle of the spill, the slow reaction afterward, it was all captured, undeniable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One reporter dropped his pen. A juror leaned forward unconsciously. And, "Darren," he flinched. His lawyer rose quickly. "Your Honor," he began, voice tense, "the defense maintains that my client was under duress. He was misled, manipulated by outside forces. He did not act alone, nor of his own volition." Judge Menrick Halden, a towering man with deep-set eyes, leaned forward slightly. "Is that so?" he asked, voice even. "Then explain this." From the prosecution bench, Investigator Lee brought forward a printed document, sliding it onto the evidence projector. The screen flickered to display a transaction receipt, dated 2 days before the flight. It showed a 5-figure deposit into Darren Vale's account from a corporate proxy tied directly to Halworth Systems. "You signed this," the prosecutor stated, stepping forward. "And that signature," he pointed, "isn't one made under duress. It's clean, steady, confident." All eyes turned to Darren. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence grew thick, unbearable. Then he swallowed hard. His voice came out hoarse. I didn't know the full plan. I was told to create a delay. Nothing more." "You burned a man's face," the prosecutor said coldly. "That wasn't a delay. That was destruction." Darren's mouth opened, but no sound came. His gaze fell to the floor, and in that moment he broke, not loudly, not with tears, but with stillness. A quiet defeat that spoke louder than any protest could. Elias watched him with neither pity nor anger, only focus. Every decision had led here, and now the chain of actions had finally reached its breaking point. Outside the courthouse, the world had already moved. News vans clustered like vultures, the hashtag Oatmeal flight stamped across every headline. Talk shows debated ethics and sabotage, while social media turned Elias into an icon of composed defiance. Yet none of them knew the final twist. Not yet. That revelation came later that evening when new details surfaced from Arkvale Systems. In a surprising statement, Arkvale's internal investigation team revealed that Lauren Keel, once a trusted deputy operations director, had attempted to delete several internal files from the company's main server just hours before his arrest. But he hadn't succeeded. Weeks earlier, Elias had anticipated sabotage. After the flight, even before the first press leak, he had quietly instructed Mason Derrick to mirror every drive connected to Arkvale's prototype systems. Every document, every line of communication, every redundant thread. He hadn't waited for justice to knock, he had built the house for it to enter. Now, with full proof in hand, investigators traced the payment chain back to a dummy account created by Cale himself. It was Lauren, not Halworth alone, who had betrayed the company from within. He had recommended Halworth for previous contracts. He had vouched for their technical integrity. And he had opened the gates. In the quiet aftermath, Mason stood by Elias's office window, watching the city lights blink against the night. "You planned for your betrayal before it began," he said, half in awe. Elias sat behind his desk, fingers brushing the glass frame that held the bent fork, the same one he had twisted on the plane, still bent sideways like a symbol of his intent. He turned to Mason, a faint smile beneath the fading scar. "No," Elias said softly. "I just learned that foresight is the sharpest weapon." He turned the fork one final time in his hand and added, "When pain becomes plan, defeat becomes design." The cabin door slid shut with a metallic thunk, sealing Flight Ryan 347 once more for its regular journey from Halvern City to Norbridge. Elias Corrin sat in seat 3A again. Same row, same aisle, same route. A different world entirely. The flight attendant hadn't made it 2 steps into the cabin before glancing down at the manifest and realizing who was seated in the front left corner of first class. Elias didn't need to look up to feel the moment of hesitation. He knew it well. It had become as routine as boarding. The shift in posture, the widened eyes, the sudden recalibration of tone. And it wasn't fear, it was memory. The new attendant, a lanky young man in his late 20s with a regulation buzz cut and polished shoes, approached cautiously with the breakfast cart. He held a tray in his hands like it was a live wire. "Would you like the oatmeal, sir? Or, we also have eggs and toast today." Elias glanced up, his gaze cool but not unkind. His face had healed in patches, leaving behind faint reddish streaks like dried rivers over terrain reshaped by heat. They didn't ache anymore, but they still spoke. "Don't worry," Elias said gently, a wry twist on his lips. "I'm not afraid of breakfast anymore." The attendant blinked, unsure whether to laugh, but Elias's tone disarmed the room. A soft chuckle rippled from a passenger 2 seats down, and the moment broke its tension. The tray was placed delicately. Elias nodded, then turned to the window. Clouds floated beneath them like thoughts not yet spoken. But his own thoughts weren't weightless. They carried form and memory, burden and purpose. From behind the glass, the world looked peaceful, untouched. But inside Elias's mind, a slow procession marched. Faces, facts, evidence. Darren Vale, convicted, serving time in a low-security facility outside Marisford, awaiting transfer to a federal complex. Lauren Keel, the real knife in the back. Once the man who oversaw supplier approvals at Arkvale, now facing trial for corporate espionage and obstruction of justice. Elias had followed every court date, every motion filed. Not for vengeance, for architecture, to study how systems broke down and, more importantly, how they could be rebuilt. He had realized long ago that wounds seek healing, but institutions require something else entirely: exposure. Truth wasn't sterile. It was uncomfortable, often painful. It forced people to squirm, to confront, to choose. That was why he never settled. Never allowed the airline's PR deal to wash over the burn. Never filed a lawsuit when he could expose something bigger than compensation. He had waited for every lie to be told publicly, so that the record of deceit became self-damning. Now, here he was again. Seat 3A. The very scene of the crime. But nothing in him flinched. Not even as the aroma of oatmeal drifted faintly from the galley. He pulled out a leather briefcase from under the seat, opening it with a quiet click. Inside, nestled between folded documents and a polished pen, was a slim, rectangular frame. Steel and glass. No wider than a phone. Within it lay the bent fork. No plaque, no engraving, just the metal, curved slightly sideways. Cleaned. Preserved. Not as a trophy. As a reminder that control, when taken away, can be taken back. That silence, once broken, can echo louder than screams. Elias leaned back. The hum of the engines grew steadier as they cruised. He watched a child in the row across lean forward against the window, pointing at the clouds like they were continents. The father, middle-aged in a gray business coat, smiled gently, adjusting the boy's seatbelt. Elias felt something unexpected rise in his chest. Not pain, not memory, but stillness. He realized something in that moment. He hadn't healed through time or treatment. He had healed by forcing the world to look at what it tried to hide. Vengeance had been a doorway. Exposure had been the cure. The landing gear lowered with a subtle vibration. Seatbelt signs chimed on. The captain's voice echoed overhead with the usual calm, rehearsed cadence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be touching down in Norbridge shortly. Thank you for flying with us." As the plane descended, Elias sat upright, tucking the framed fork back into his case. No one around him paid him much attention anymore. The cameras, the articles, the courtrooms, it had all faded from public obsession into archived memory. But for Elias, it hadn't faded. It had just taken form. When the wheels touched down and the brakes whispered against the runway, passengers clapped lightly, a custom that had returned in the post-scandal months. Elias didn't join in. He simply waited. People began to rise, reaching for bags, stretching limbs, resuming lives. Elias stood slowly, lifting his case with one hand. His steps were even, composed, unshaken. At the threshold of the cabin, just before stepping into the jet bridge, he paused. The air was crisp outside. The scent of airport fuel and autumn leaves drifted faintly through the corridor. Elias looked ahead. No one remembered the man with the burn anymore. And that was fine. They would remember something else. As he walked away, the metal fork, now polished and framed, waited in his briefcase like a private reminder. "Scars fade," he whispered to himself. "But the lessons carved by heat never do." He tried to make another man's day miserable and watched his own reputation melt instead. If you believe respect always outlasts arrogance, subscribe now, because real power never needs to spill over. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, humiliation, and the consequences of prejudice and abuse of power. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, accountability, and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect.